Hello everyone. Good morning. In Brazil, 10 a.m. In Europe, 2 p.m. We will start our seminar about World REX market. This seminar will be conducted by me, Fernando Lopes, from Instituto Totum, and j.braslawsky from IREX Standard Foundation. First of all, I would like to thank our longtime partners in the seminar, Abragel, Abeólica, CCE, Abracel, Abiogás, and Abren. I'd like to some quick guidelines. Please use the Zoom chat for your questions. Your questions can be both in Portuguese or in English, no problem. If possible, I would like you, the audience, to change your personal identification with name and company, if possible. Recalling that the seminar will be recorded and will be made available in our internet platforms. And we will have about 25 to 30 minutes with explanations and clarification of doubts that usually comes to us. And we have another 10, 15 minutes for questions and answers from the live chat. Okay, I will start with some numbers from REX, our program here in Brazil. As you see, we have more than 140 registered devices. That all those devices representing something like 10,000 megawatts of power. It's like 80% of Itaipu, just to have an idea. But we have more than 100 devices that are registered. In 2020, we have already issued around 3 million IREX, and we will probably reach around 5 million IREX by the end of this year. It's our expectation. Look that we started in 2014 with just 244 REX, and now we are close to 3 million, and we finish this year with around 5 million issued REX. This slide shows the evolution since 2015. It's important to notice the significant increase in transactions with IREX with the seal, with the sustainability seal REC Brazil. If you see in 2019, REC Brazil was represented something like less than 10%, around 5 to 7% of the total. And now in 2020, REC Brazil represents something like 30% of total issuance. I mean, buyers here in Brazil are more interested in sustainable RECs, and that's the intention of our program. My last slide. Today in Brazil, we have more than 30 companies that are engaged in IREC. We involve energy generators, traders, and brokers. And now we welcome companies from Eletrobras Group that recently joined IREC. I mean, Chesf and Furnas from the biggest group from the government, Eletrobras. Although most devices are big energy plants, there are some devices registered in decentralized energy generation. like a few solar rooftops that are registered in Iraq. Okay, now I give floor to Jared, who will present himself and give us a world view about the use of renewable energy certificates. Jared, welcome.
Great. Thanks a lot, Fernando. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak to everyone. It's great to be here. I'm j.braslawsky. I'm based in the Netherlands, and I'm the Executive Director of the International REC Standard Foundation. I would say the International REC Standard Foundation, it's based in the Netherlands for historical reasons, and that's because in the origin, we took a lot of lessons learned from the guarantee of origin market in Europe, who's been around for about 20 years, and who actually one of the chairman of the board of the IREC Standard Foundation was involved with the original development. He was one of the original founders of the guarantee of origin system in Europe, which is the REC system in Europe for 20 years. And he founded that in the beginning and created essentially all of the structures that are there today as well. And that market, just as an example, is about 800 to 900 terawatt hours on an annual basis in Europe now. So it's a really very sizable market. And you're also looking at guarantees of origins in Europe that are not just for renewables, but also for non-renewables. So you're seeing RECs, and that's where you really see what the definition of a REC is and what the definition of these are. Because a REC, and this is what Fernando said very, very well, isn't about good or bad. It isn't about sustainable or unsustainable. It's about proof. It's about accounting. It's about knowing the origin of your electricity. And it's about giving individuals information about that. And individuals can have their own decisions if they think their RECs are good or bad, or they can use sustainability labels like the REC Brazil to make sure that the purchase that they're having has been verified by a third party as sustainable. So there's lots of different ways for consumers to get a product that they believe is good for their company and the environment as well. But the REC itself, the instrument itself, is just a fact-based mechanism providing that proof. So Fernando, just a short introduction, and now we'll go a little bit to the foundation. So I'll give a short introduction now to the history of the IREC Standard Foundation, a bit about the market geographies, some statistics for REC markets around the world, and also with the IREC standard. And then I'll finish my short presentation with the IREC standard in Brazil. I won't take any longer than 5 or 10 minutes, so I'm going to go relatively quickly. And as Fernando mentioned, I believe questions at the end, please feel free to give questions. I'd be happy to answer those. And that's, I think, the best portion of the webinar. Next slide, Fernando. So the IREC Standard Foundation, much like the work with Fernando, that Fernando started as well in Brazil, was in 2014. And in 2014, we actually started because we saw a need for the development of standardized REC markets. At that time, I was working with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 guidance document, working by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GHGP. And they were essentially acknowledging for the first time that to be able to make a claim to renewable electricity, and I'm ignoring a lot of complexities there, to be able to make a claim to renewable electricity, you would need to have a REC to be able to make that claim in the most robust way. And we recognized at that time that the only place with standardized REC markets where you really knew the criteria involved was the US and Europe at that time with the EEC standard. So the IREC Standard Foundation is a nonprofit organization, and we as a nonprofit started to work to develop a standard for the implementation of voluntary REC systems around the world, but so that we could know a REC in Brazil or a REC in Chile or a REC in Panama, or a REC in potentially Australia or in China or in India, they all adhere to the same general criteria. That makes it easier for corporate clients to purchase renewable electricity because they don't need to dig into the details of every single REC they're doing. They can just purchase what is best for them. After about 6 years of work, so we started at the end of 2014, so really 5 years of work, we are redefining the governance structure in 2020. And Fernando, if you go to the next slide, I'll show that a little bit because the governance structure is actually quite simple, you could say. I know this makes it look quite challenging, but you should just know that at the top is the IREC Standard Foundation. We have rules, regulations, best practices in place to make sure that rec markets are introduced on national basis in a well-defined and standardized way. So we've got a package of documents of about, a set of rules of about 40 pages, plus contracts and additional guidance documents and additional best practices that are implemented by market facilitators. And a market facilitator is an organization like Instituto Totum. So they are a neutral entity. They do not participate in buying, selling, or trading of certificates. There is no competitive nature whatsoever in the work they're doing. And the work that they're doing is facilitating the rules of the IREC standard above in a national area. That's all that is. But they're doing it for everyone, the market players underneath, in the exact same way. So everyone has a fair opportunity to participate on the market in a fair way. And everyone knows that what is being done is adherent to the international standards, which are adherent to the international best practices and rules and regulations. So there's a lot of cooperation, for example, between myself and Fernando. And then there's a lot of cooperation between, for example, the Instituto Totum, you could say, and the market players. So you see how the connections then between the various organizations all link together. And this is done contractually, and it's also done through what we call accreditation and best practices. Next slide. As I mentioned previously, there's 3 major rec standards in the world. And the first rec standard, I would say, not first, just the first that I'll mention, is the North American rec market. That's in the US and Canada. Then you have the guarantee of origin market in Europe, which is led by the Association of Issuing Bodies and also some European legislation. And then after that, you have the International Rec Standard, which is active in the countries that you see on the map. And then, of course, there are other countries that are coming by as we get in contact with the national governments, as we get in contact with stakeholders, as we're able to identify organizations locally that are able and willing to adopt the IREC standard. Next slide. This slide you'll see is then the issuers that are currently active on the IREC standard that are then using the IREC standard, implementing that on a local basis in their specific jurisdiction. So you'll see, of course, that Instituto Totum in Brazil is then dark blue, but there's local issuers in lots of countries from Chile to Colombia, to Russia, to even the Congo and Saudi Arabia and Singapore. And these issuers are all different types of organizations because you have issuers that are private companies. You have issuers, for example, in Singapore and in Thailand, who are the grid operators. So essentially in Singapore and Thailand. And you have also in, for example, the United Arab Emirates, where it is the ministry itself that is the issuer. So you have a lot of different types of organizations that can be issuer, and this is completely normal in even in the European context as well. If you would see a map of Europe with all the different countries and all the different issuers, in Europe as well, for example, you have private companies like the European Energy Exchange that is a issuer in France. You have ministries that are the issuer, for example, in Sweden, and other locations. And then you have, for example, grid operators that are the issuer, for example, in the Netherlands. So this is completely normal with rec markets, how this functions, and it's something that the IREC standard also supports. Next slide. Just a little bit about the global growth of rec systems around the world. So you'll see at the top, that is the growth of the guarantee of origin system, as I mentioned before, growing year over year. This stops at 2019. At the bottom left, you'll see the growth in the IREC standard market year over year. This is also 2019. And I think in every single one of these charts, 2020 will again be a step higher. So I don't think that that's an expectation that anyone has that this is going to become something kind of flatten out, because the reality is this is becoming more and more and more structural in electricity markets generally. So I think you're only going to see REC markets flatten out when you start seeing essentially RECs meeting all of the issuance of megawatt hours in a country. And because then you really have that one-to-one about what is issued is what is being claimed. So I think that you're just going to see that slowly grow until it's really matching country issuance. And then at the bottom right, you have the US REC sales. So those are also growing as well. This is some cumulative IREC standard data for the global market. So you'll see on the top left, that is the cumulative number of devices registered in the IREC standard. So 2020, and I say year to date because it's still going to be growing, of course, but you'll see how it's developed from 2014 until 2020. And then at the bottom, that is yearly redemptions in terawatt hours. So it really has been growing quite a bit from 2015, 2016, 2017, when the IREC standard was just getting started. And you've seen large growth in 2018, 2019, 2020, and this is likely to continue moving forward as well. Next slide. So you have here information about the various types of statistics in Brazil. I'm just going to go through one by one the various statistics in Brazil. So at the top left, you'll see the installed capacity, the megawatts in Brazil per technology group. And that's interesting because, as we all know, hydropower has huge installed capacity generally compared to, for example, wind, and definitely compared to solar. So you just make sense that a fewer devices from hydro will have a much higher installed capacity rating on the IREC in any system in Brazil and anywhere else, because hydro just has a much higher installed capacity. But then you'll see below that the redemptions of certificates coming from Brazil are largely coming from wind resources. So wind resources are significantly more demanded than other types of resources in Brazil. But I would imagine as well, and Fernando would have to correct me if I'm wrong, but this is also partly a REC Brazil criteria as well, that REC Brazil likely has criteria on sustainability, but I don't know about this. Fernando, just very quickly.
Yes. For REC Brazil, hydro devices are only eligible with less than 30 megawatt. Yep. So very large hydro power can issue IRECs, but not issue IRECs with REC Brazil.
Yeah, exactly. And then what you've seen recently as well, as Fernando mentioned, is that the REC Brazil, of course, REC Brazil combined with IREC is growing in usage year over year. And that's also probably being shown in that statistic at the bottom left as well, with the use of wind certificates. At the top right, you see the location in which the beneficiary is located for RECs coming from Brazil. So you can see that more than 95%, 90% of the RECs that are produced from Brazil are also redeemed in Brazil. But there is a portion of RECs from Brazil that are exported, for example, to Argentina, that doesn't have an IREC system in place and doesn't have a really good REC system in place at all at the moment. That's something we're working on as the IREC standard. We hope to have Argentina as an authorized issuance country within the next few months. But until then, you see that some exports from Brazil are going to Argentina because they just don't have a good viable option. And you see as well that a majority of the exports from Brazil are to neighboring countries. So it's almost always the case. And then at the bottom right, you'll see the issuance per vintage. And this is a different statistic than Fernando was mentioning regarding the issuance in 2020, because I have to mention very quickly, vintage is related to the date in which the physical electricity was produced. So if the physical electricity was produced in November 2019, you could still receive an IREC in April 2020, for example. And that would count under the 2019 bar in this slide because it's still from power coming from 2019. So the vintage is then 2019. And it has a star because you can issue for vintage 2020 until the residual mix deadline. I'm not going to go into the details about that, but the residual mix deadline is on May 15th of the next year. So that means you can issue for 2020 certificates until May 15th of 2021. And that's why 2020, it looks much lower, but it will be significantly higher than 2019 when it's eventually closed after May 15th. Next slide. And this is, I believe, one of my last slides before we jump into some questions. And that is issuance per country by vintage. I think this is really interesting, especially for Brazil, because Brazil is, of course, a large electricity market, but it's nowhere near as large of an electricity market, for example, as China. And even then, it is producing on a certificate basis about 1/3 of the certificates that a country like China is producing as well. And of all the countries in the IREC standard, Brazil is the second producing IREC country, you could say, under the IREC standard. So it has a significant amount of issuance in 2019. We do expect that 2020 is going to surpass 2019 as well, likely going to be larger. And I just put all other countries because there's lots more IREC countries than I listed here, but all other IREC countries are essentially producing about 871,000 megawatt hours, so about 871 gigawatt hours of issuance, apologies, on an annual basis, or at least in 2019. The relevant aspect here is the same thing that I mentioned about the residual mix deadline is relevant here as well. So even though 2020 looks less than 2019 in all of these markets, that will still grow until May 15th of next year. So until May 15th of 2021, you'll still be able to issue for 2020 vintage. So I believe that was a short introduction. Fernando, maybe you can click on the next slide to make sure this was my last slide. I believe so. Yeah, and that was it. So I hope that was, Fernando, clear, maybe if not too quick. But of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that people have after we're moving a bit further.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Before the questions from the audience, I have three questions that we received from time to time from our participants, registrants, and even companies that consumes IRECs. A fashionable topic here in Brazil, I think it's fashionable in the world too, is the use of blockchain in the energy sector, and specifically in the RECs market, generation, issuing, and transferring IRECs with blockchain technology. What have you seen around the world about that? What's your personal point of view about blockchain?
Sure. So maybe I should start that we have been working on working groups with blockchain, including large blockchain organizations, including EWF and many other organizations, the Energy Web Foundation, for those of you that don't know, since already, I think, about 4 or 5 years. So a little bit before kind of you would say the fashionability of blockchain came into fashion, I would say we were already active on this topic. And I think first we need to define blockchain, of course. Blockchain is nothing more than what we call a distributed ledger. So that means it's really the concept that there's multiple databases with various organizations checking those databases, sometimes public, sometimes, you know, there's an authority mechanism like an issuer that is verifying that with other organizations as well. And as this is a technology question then, because it's really about how the data is stored, it's slightly separate from the IREC standard itself, because IREC standard doesn't really care what technology is used to facilitate the REC market. It has to still adhere to the best practices and the standards of the IREC standard. So I think technology standpoints, we support any technology that is able to meet the requirements of the IREC standard. And that's really been quite important for us as well as we've been thinking about how best to do this, because we have to separate blockchains into 2 separate types. 1, an asset-based blockchain, and 2, a non-asset-based blockchain. So a non-asset-based blockchain is like Bitcoin. All of us know cryptocurrencies, because the value in a Bitcoin is the token. It's the Bitcoin itself. There's nothing before the Bitcoin that is valuable. But with asset-based blockchains, arguably, for example, something we hear a lot in the Netherlands, at least, is ownership of land. That would be controlled by blockchain databases, or even renewable electricity like megawatt hours. The problem is that the blockchain, the bit, the token, is not the asset. The asset is the land. So we have to make sure that the land, or maybe if we're talking about renewable electricity, the megawatt hour, is still not double counted. So even though the blockchain could be fantastic from beginning to end, that doesn't mean that there aren't multiple blockchains counting the same asset. So that's why, even though blockchain could be a very good solution, we still need standards to make sure that the asset itself is being well organized from the very, very beginning. And then the technology used to do that can be anything. And what we've done recently that Fernando will know about is we've been working with issuers like Instituto Totum, and also many different platform providers like marketplaces, to allow them to have what is called, and I don't want to be too technical, but have an API with the registry provider. So the registry provider, IREX Services, they would allow to have an API in place where blockchain marketplaces can link into the database, and with blockchain allow for trading or smart contracts or all these different types of things that are popular with blockchain. And then of course, Instituto Totum is, I think, working on a project as well related to, before there's a creation of an IREC, making sure that this is essentially verified together with the grid operator locally and many other systems to make sure that this is also verified from the very, very beginning. So the IREC standard thinks these initiatives are great, it's fantastic, but we don't require it because there isn't necessarily a fundamental benefit to it. But it is, of course, something that if it's long-term and shows that it's supporting and developing these markets worldwide, then it's something that we can integrate together with third parties and together with local issuers as well.
Okay, thanks, Jared. In addition, what you said, I'd like to mention that since the beginning of 2020, Instituto Totum implemented a system. It's called SysRec Ledger, where we put 100% of the Brazilian IREC emissions. They are registered in a blockchain, in the cloud. We see this blockchain as something like a second layer of security in the process of issuing IRECs. As you see in the right part of the slide, there is a hash code that is generated for each IREC issuance. Using this hash code, any player of the market can check to prove the authenticity of the IREC. Okay, it's a second layer of security. It not replace the IREC registry, but it complements the IREC registry. Okay, that's our point of view. And here in Brazil, we are working with some organization that wants to implement their own blockchain to manage the trade part of the IRECs, and they want to implement some kind of blockchain. When we are working together in order to get it done. Okay, I don't know if there are more questions about blockchain, but in a minute we will answer. Another question that some people asked us is about consumption. Let's talk now about consumption, not generation of IRECs, the companies that buy IRECs. In terms of company that consume energy, renewable energy, and the use IRECs, what are the best market practices? I mean, some companies ask us, do I have to match monthly consumption to monthly IRECs, or I can use only 1 month to all consumption of the year? others say, what's the validity of having a PPA with one organization and buy and bundle racks with other organization? Is this the best practice? And still other want sustainable labels. Okay, what are the best practices that we've seen?
Yeah, so I would say if anyone's interested, please contact me, because there is an organization, Rex International, that has produced a document called essentially best practices in the rec market. And there's also, of course, RE100. I also participate on the technical advisor group of RE100 that has created a document called Leadership in Renewable Energy Procurement. So these are really good resources that you can use to start understanding this in more detail. But as you mentioned, Fernando, there isn't a single best practice. There's a lot of different things, and every company needs to decide what best practice is right for them. And some companies choose to say, listen, we only want to procure renewables from within a 10-kilometer radius of where we consume electricity. That's possible, sure, and that's great. Another organization may say, if it's January, we only want to consume RECs that were produced in January. That's also another choice. And then you have, for example, sustainability labels. You have additionality labels. You've got lots of different types of labels there that all have different criteria that you can choose from, whether it's related to biodiversity or whether it's related to creating new renewable technology on the grid. So there's a lot of different labels available as well. And then, as Fernando also mentioned, there's procurement methods. I mean, you can purchase RECs from the same organization that was delivering you the physical power, or if it's possible, directly from the generator, and maybe that's better, or maybe procuring it from a device that was built that isn't built yet and is going to be built, and you sign a contract with them saying, when you build this device, we will take all of your RECs for 5 years and we'll pay you a specific amount of money for that. So I think there's a lot of different ways to have best practices, and it all boils down to essentially, are your best practices for, local production? Is that your vision of best practice? Is it for just the production of new renewable electricity anywhere that it can be done? That's also a best practice. That's a vision. Is your best practice related to the environment and biodiversity? Is your best practice related to essentially the seasonality and all these other sorts of things? So you can kind of, as a company, look to see what is important to us, what is part of the story that we have as a company, and then purchase RECs that meet those criteria.
Okay, it's important to say that here in Brazil, we are the boundary for a company to buy electricity in the free market, as we say, is going down. So in the past, only large companies could buy energy in the free market, that's we say. Yep. Others are captive. And now the boundary is going down. So it's an opportunity for even more companies to buy electricity and looking for renewables. Yep. One last question. That we have seen some organizations that say that are using renewable electricity and do this by a contract or some kind of blockchain or some non-standardized REC system. On the other hand, you have seen some energy producers that are trying to take their own RECs without any third-party validation. Sure. What do you see in the world about that? Yeah. What's your point of view?
So maybe just really quickly about that, I think we first have to recognize what a REC is. And a REC is nothing more than a standardized contract between a producer and a consumer. And that standardized contract has the same criteria, same fundamental attributes, same rights, and same regulations for everyone on the whole market. So we make sure that essentially that REC is an agreement between the buyer and the seller, and it has lots of different elements included. And those elements are built up by the IREC standard, is built up by the contracts in place with the local issuers, built up by lots of different things. These standards are in place. And then the question is, you could say, anyone can create a REC system because they can create a contract. but that doesn't mean that that contract is really standardized or really valid for the specific claims. And the other problem remains associated with that is the idea of having multiple contracts, different types of contracts with different meanings and different purposes in place. Because if there's all these different systems in place, one, you have a problem, just like with blockchain, that megawatt hour could be counted in different systems, that's a problem. Or you could also have the problem of essentially confusion, or that stakeholders think they're getting something that they are not. And the most important aspect of the IREC standard is that we create essentially a system from the top down where there's a standard in place, there's facilitators that facilitate the market in a neutral way, and then market players. And if you have organizations that are not very clear with the boundaries of the various organizations, you can have a lot of problems. Because if you have that standardized contract, that REC, and it's cheaper, for example, to get the REC to one party than it is to another party, it's unfair competition, of course, because you are essentially working with an underlying product, an underlying commodity in some ways, and that has to be the same for every user on that system. One, just for their general understanding, and two, for a fair market more generally. The last thing I'd like to say is that there's really no benefit in having multiple REC systems, because what we want is that end users are competing for renewable attributes and not competing, one, to understand various systems and what the differences are between them, and two, potentially trying to figure all these differences out, in a specific national region where it may not be legislated or well defined as is. So I think that it's really important that we try and work towards standardized systems where everyone has a clearly defined role and everyone is, essentially with a very clear position in the market, either as a market player, as a market facilitator, or as a standard setter.
Okay, it's important to the companies that consumes renewable energy to understand these concepts. Now we have the questions from the audience. Let me see. One question from Julian. Can I register a plant in a country that does not have a local issuer?
So if there's no issuer in a country, it is currently not possible to issue in that country. And this is a very, very critical portion of the IREC standard, because as I mentioned, the IREC standard is really about creating that contract between the producer and the consumer. And for us to be 100% sure that that end user is able to make an agreement with the consumer to be able to make an agreement with the producer and say, we are able to consume renewable electricity from this production device in this location, we have to be 100% sure that the stakeholders, the market parties, the governments in the local jurisdiction are okay with the development of that voluntary market. And there's no legislation in place that prohibits that. So maybe some of you are close to Argentina and maybe you'll have some idea of how the Argentinian system works. But the Argentinian system, and this is why we have taken so long to develop the system in Argentina, there is complexities in place because of their subsidy system. Their subsidy system says that large users of electricity need to purchase electricity, renewable electricity, from essentially a centralized source. This is CAMESA or through MATER. And I won't go into the details on this, but essentially we had to figure out 100% that if we were going to be issuing certificates to devices that are falling under MATER or falling under CAMESA and are delivering attributes to end users for the law, that it wouldn't be double counted if it was also being done for IREC. So to develop that, to learn about that, we had to work with the ministry, we had to work with stakeholders, we had to work with many different producers and local operators. And now we are coming to a place where we're going to be allowing for the issuance of RECs in Argentina, but only with certain restrictions in place to make sure there is absolutely no double counting whatsoever. And that's really another important aspect looking back at blockchain. Blockchain is great to facilitate that but they aren't great to come up with the rules and regulations and the policy associated with what can be issued or what cannot be issued. So that's really where the IREX standard comes in. And then again, blockchain can do that. Any different organizations can do that as long as it's in line with the criteria and the regulations there.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. Jared, in your presentation, one slide shows that IREX from Brazil are exported, but I always understood that IREX are essentially to internal market. Could you explain what exports REX really mean? I think
Sure.
you mentioned in your presentation, but
Yeah.
you can emphasize again.
No, that's fine. So when a REC is issued, it's always issued in a national market because the device is located in a country. So a wind turbine is located 20 kilometers outside of Sao Paulo. It's going to go to Instituto Totum to request a certificate. That certificate is issued. And on that certificate, it says issued from a wind turbine 20 kilometers outside of Sao Paulo at this time, with this location, with this type of installed capacity, all the different criteria on that REC. And then that REC will be traded, or it could be all these different things, and then it can be redeemed. And then when it's redeemed, the owner of the REC has to mention 4 things. The purpose of the redemption for scope 2 claiming or renewable electricity usage, or maybe a local disclosure regulation or something like this. The beneficiary, so the end user that's claiming it. The usage time period, is it being used for 2019, for 2020? Is it being used for May 2020? They can put in whatever they want. And also the location of usage. Is it being used in Sao Paulo? Is it being used in Salvador? Is it being used in Argentina? So we don't have criteria on where it is going to be used because the IREX standard is a facilitation mechanism. So we don't have criteria on the market boundaries. So IREX standard allows certificates to be exported. But the reality is an end user in Chile is unlikely to want a certificate from Brazil. So even though it is possible to give that to an end user in Chile, it's very unlikely that they're going to purchase it. And that's why you see the majority of the exports are only to places where consumers have no other option, like Argentina right now at the moment. If it's in Chile where there is a REC system, an IREX standard accredited system in place, then it's unlikely that they will import Brazilian RECs, even though that is possible.
Okay, fine. Another question here. Would it be possible in the near future to pay the transfer fees in local currency instead of paying in Europe?
Yeah, so that's definitely a market facilitator question and something that can be worked on together with Instituto Totum, I think, and together as well with the registry operator and the code manager as well. And I think these organizations can come up, if they can come up with the right legal structures and the right structures in place, I do think that that would be possible. There's nothing within the IREX standard that wouldn't allow that. But I think there are, of course, legal, technical, and tax issues that need to be accomplished before that can be possible. But as the markets in different locations grow, like the Brazilian market is growing quite a bit, it becomes more relevant to try and make things as local as possible for many different stakeholders. And I think that is one aspect as well. The great benefit, of course, of having Instituto Totum as a local issuer is they do everything locally. It's all under Brazilian law. It's all with the Brazilian currency. It's all of these different things are in place, and it makes it much easier for Brazilian operators. The problem is participants are per definition global. So even though a registrant is based in a country and has generation in Brazil, a participant is per definition, even though they may only work in the Brazilian market, they can work anywhere in the world. And as such, they need a contract with the registry operator or the code manager that allows them to work anywhere in the world as well. So there are some complexities, but it is possible in the future.
Okay, fine. People here in Brazil, participants will be glad to know that, because it's not easy to pay outside Brazil. We have
Sure.
a lot of bureaucracy.
Of
And
course.
our last question from Melina Ushida. She works with green gas. Does IREC apply only for electricity? Would the standard be applied to other forms of energy like gas, ethanol, diesel, fuel, and so? I think green gas is it's a field that you
Sure, definitely. And I can imagine that green gas is quite becoming a budding resource in Brazil, of course. I can definitely imagine that with the resources, the natural resources available. Melina, I'm very happy that you asked that, by the way, because part of our re-governance structure in early 2020 was to allow the IREC standard to be applied to any energy or even non-energy resource that requires a booking claim system. So requires this type of system to be in place. So starting even today, it is possible for the IREC standard to be implemented for green gas, for hydrogen, for aviation fuels maybe, but maybe also even for metals recycling. For any place where it's hard to track the physical commodity because of a grid or because of a structure is in place that makes it difficult to track, the IREC standard could potentially be implemented in line with that. And then of course the IREC standard is there and we would just need to work with the right market facilitators. So Melina, if you know the right market facilitators and you're able to do that, please feel free to reach out to us as well. And we'd be happy to discuss what the options are and how best to move this forward, because it's something that I think is becoming more and more important over the next few years.
Okay, Jared, here in Brazil, Totum Institute, we are working. We started with a certification named Gas REC.
Yep.
It's for green gas, and we look forward for the standardized rules that IREC will issue, so we can comply with the international standard, so we make our system in Brazil more robust.
No, I think so. And I think it'd be great as well. Yeah, no, I think that'd be great, because I think Brazil has been a real model for the rest of the world in how to introduce these systems on a voluntary basis. And I think it's been a huge adoption by local end users and local organizations. Brazil, of course, has a lot of foreign investment from other countries as well. So these companies as well also recognize that having those standards in place having those international standards in place make everything just easier. So it's really been a huge benefit in Brazil doing this exercise with electricity until now. And I think doing that with other commodities in the very near future is definitely a good idea.
Okay, it's 10:47. We are 2 minutes after the time. It's time to finish the seminar. Chair, could you please share your final comments?
Just wanted to say thank everyone for having me here today. I think it was fantastic to be able to speak to everyone through at least this medium. Hopefully next year we can do it in person. I think that would be my preference, to come visit everyone for maybe an in-person webinar that we can do in longer form and we can really have more interaction. And I look forward to seeing everyone potentially next year. So thanks everyone, and I appreciate you for having me again.
Okay, I'd like to thank you everyone too, and mention that the seminar will be soon available at Totum, IREC, and REC Brazil web pages and YouTube. Okay, bye-bye. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.